Hello, everyone. Welcome to the sixth webinar on how funders can strengthen democracy. I can see you all trickling in. Thank you for waiting as we kind of had a little chat between us as speakers just before. I am going to introduce myself and Six and the speakers today and encourage you all to use the Q&A function if you have burning questions for the speakers, maybe as we begin. And as you hear the conversation evolve, and there's a survey link that we'll send at the end, and that's for you to kind of share any remaining thoughts or reflections or questions that you might have for us, you know, after the conversation ends, and maybe some of the conversation is still percolating in your minds, you know, long after we've finished. But it's lovely to have you all with us. My name is Josiane, and I'm one of the program leads at Six. For those of you who don't know, Six is a global organization focused on accelerating learning and exchange to address social challenges across silos. Six is more than a network and more than just conversations. We have a decade of hello. Sorry for the feedback. We have more than a decade of experience in global social innovation leadership, and we were established over 15 years ago with the purpose of building the capacity of forward-thinking social innovation leaders across philanthropy, governments, cities, companies, NGOs, and civil society, developing new tools and frameworks and fostering groups of supportive peers that could create pathways for others to follow. Following our 2023 Funders Retreat on uniting philanthropy to advance civic engagement and action in partnership with the Headwaters Foundation and other local funders in Montana, we've continued thinking about major challenges facing our global democracies today and how funders can work as part of an ecosystem to address these. So during this 75-minute online discussion today, we are going to discuss both the why and the how of funding democracy-focused work, emphasizing the need for collective effort, challenging notions of neutrality and risk, and sharing unconventional and transformational approaches firsthand from the speakers to attempting to counter authoritarianism and protecting our democratic cultures and institutions against future shocks. With me are three esteemed speakers: Lisbeth Pilegaard, Chair of the Executive Committee of the European Endowment for Democracy. We also have Witter, the co-founder and CEO of Apolitical Foundation, and Željko Jovanović, the president of the relatively newly established Roma Foundation for Europe. I'm going to invite the speakers to properly introduce themselves in a moment, but again, let me welcome everyone warmly to the conversation today and invite you to share your questions with us using the Q&A. All speakers seconded that they wanted to hear from the audience today your questions, and we've dedicated a good amount of time towards the end for that. So we'll pull out some of those questions and hopefully and get to them later on. Without further ado, let's start with the question that has brought us all here, which is about why funders need to engage in democracy. And Lisa, can I ask you to go first? I love the last time we had the chat about this, and I'd love you to frame some of your thinking in that.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone, wherever you are in the world, for joining us. I think I can speak for all four of us how much we appreciate you caring to come, and we really want to hear from you. So I almost honestly, when I got this question, why do funders need to engage in democracy, kind of tilted my head like it's pretty obvious, right? But let me just talk for just a minute about where we're at right now. There's a quote by Plato that I think about with all of the asterisks about Plato as a man, and democracy wasn't perfect, and there's many other views. But he says that the price good men pay for indifference to public affairs is to be ruled by evil men. And I think many of us, depending on when we came to age, thought we were living in the end of history, kind of thought that sort of we had a view that democracy was the best way forward. And so we just keep on marching. And as you can see through index after index, that belief has been overtaken by, even with inside previously strong democracies, people perhaps choosing not to want to live in a democracy anymore for various reasons, external state actors pushing things, or people feeling like democracy isn't delivering. And that was really the basis for why I co-founded with Robin Scott 8+ years ago, the Apolitical family. And we see democracy as a flywheel where citizens elect the politicians then deliver the mandate to the civil servants, and then the citizens, along with the civil servants, help deliver on that democracy. And the company, 170 countries, 230,000 members, thinks about what government can do to help deliver on that democracy. What are the skills? And our foundation is about what's the political leadership we need for the 21st century. Let me just end with a framework and then a bit of a provocation. We're really living with 18th century politics and 19th century institutions with 20th century technology, with 21st century challenges and opportunities as we need to look forward to the 22nd century. And one of the things I think that our democracies haven't caught up with is different expectations that people have about delivering and about engagement and about agency. So as we have this conversation, I want us to stretch from thinking about defense of the status quo to offense, to what this new information age, this new industrial revolution of our time, particularly with AI, what are the different expectations? My provocation is, as I've been in these conversations, I'm super excited to get into the deeper funder discussion, but my provocation is, as I've been in conversations with donors and individuals who work on democracy, I realize that people actually really don't want democracy. They want their worldview to win. And democracy is about a place where people with multiple worldviews come together to figure out how we pluralistically live together. So my provocation is, are we really talking about democracy? Do we really want a sense of governing for and by the people and with the people? Or are we talking about having a worldview in which we are right? So I'll turn it over back to you.
Thank you. That was the provocation I hoped you would start with. So we've kicked off with a bang. Lisbeth, maybe I can ask you to go next.
Thanks, and also great to see that there is people logging in from all over the world. I chair the executive committee of the European Endowment for Democracy, which is a organization established in Brussels in the wake of the Arab Spring, or the so-called Arab Spring, where it was clear that EU institutions fell short of finding good, agile and quick solutions to support democracy activists in the Middle East. We've then since grown and are working in the European neighborhood countries and the neighbors of the neighbors, and are looking beyond that as well. So we fund democracy activism and activists, looking very broadly. So there's no fixed term definition on what that entails, but that when people have good ideas that will support pluralism and a pluralistic system and a democratic society, we are able to fund. We are able to fund quickly. We're able to fund organizations and individuals, organizations that are not registered. So we're getting back to, we'll talk about it later, about this taking risks and so on. And we've managed to lay our fundament as being a risk-taking organization because democracy matters, back to the initial question, Josiane. And I agree with Lisa that it's we have systems and we have thoughts and we have problems that don't really adjust well. And it's time for innovation. So I think what Lisa and others are doing are really, really important. And we hope to be the one giving the seed funding for new and young people, presumably, who are coming up with great ideas how to support our democracies. On the why, well, I think it's essential when we look at all the research done on how democratic countries do compared to other less democratic societies. They do much better, and that's on the indicators that I think we can all agree to. We live longer, we're more healthy, we have a better wealth, we have a more wealth equally distributed, and we have more peace. And I think those are values or conditions that most people subscribe to. So I think the why is there, but the reality is that 71% of the population in the world do not live in democracies. So there's enough for us to do.
Mm-hmm. And there's something that you and I discussed, Lisa, early on before I bring Željko in, is around the fact that unstable political climates make the work of philanthropy and different types of funders really hard. It is a greater challenge. And as you said, the ideals of a democratic culture and society are very much aligned with many foundations around the world, especially those who don't consider themselves as democracy funders. And I think there's a framing issue here that perhaps we can explore as we think about the need to work collectively going forwards. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Željko, over to you. Would you like to introduce yourself and a reminder of that question? Why do funders need to engage in democracy?
Thank you, Lucian, and it's really an honor to be part of this conversation. Željko Jovanović, working with the newly established, as you mentioned, since February, Roma Foundation for Europe as a legacy foundation of the 4 decades of work of Open Society Foundations. So engaging in this question, as Lisa was effective provocateur at the beginning, I'll start with this: democracy didn't deliver. Let's start first with what we wanted the democracy to deliver. The democracy cannot deliver everything. And it wasn't meant to be a mechanism of governance to deliver on everything. So democracy was fought for, and many try to keep it and maintain it, who want to protect themselves as individuals or citizens against oppressive governments. History has shown, at least Stalin had shown, that you can have economic growth even without democracy. China shows this very well as any other country that is on democracy and doing well in terms of GDP. Democracy was not an answer to how do we grow economically. It was an answer, how do we protect individuals' rights by having those in power guaranteeing certain protections of our dignity, of our freedom, and our individual prosperity. So in that sense, whether democracy has delivered, I would say absolutely. Whether this is still the case, yes. People, of course, can speak about poverty as the ultimate violence of the systems that we live in. But when we talk about protections, at least in constitutional democracies, liberal democracies, those protections are there. If one can see the migration flows, people who want freedom across the globe, they don't migrate to Russia, China, or Saudi Arabia. They migrate to Europe and United States and other places where they feel they need protection of their rights, of their lives, vis-a-vis oppressive regimes. So in that sense, I would say that we need to distinguish what exactly the democracy has to deliver. When we put this in the context, in the context of this discussion, where we talk about funders and philanthropy, we also need to recognize that philanthropy is possible even when there is no democracy. So we can have charity work, but those who engage on democracy have ideological predisposition. So this is deeply ideological work. This is not neutral work. Whoever tries to present this is not really clear, or is trying to make other people not clear. At the same time, building on what Lisa said in the beginning, the liberal consensus is at least shaken, if not broken. We are far beyond the point of end of history. And this is just to say that we have obtained democracy collectively, and we need to fight it collectively. And of course, fighting for democracy is dangerous because you have far-right populists, authoritarians, or wannabe authoritarians who will use any means to abolish the rights of the individuals to question, to think critically, etc. So that's why some resources, some funding need to come from somewhere. This is the role of the funders. But as I said, this is an ideological point of view, in which we look at democracy as a comparatively better system to deliver on freedom of individuals against oppression.
Thank you. Thank you all three speakers for setting us up with these provocations. I heard very strong language around freedom, individual rights, ideologies, political leadership, pluralism, citizenship, the liberal consensus. These are big questions to begin with. I also heard, Željko, in your opening about the role of economic growth and protecting individuals. And I think about the trade-offs and the tensions that funders have to navigate not just funders, but multiple sectors to navigate their agendas in the world as we know it today. So let's think about the collective effort and the ways that funders can play a role alongside others to support and strengthen democracy. So maybe you can share, Željko, maybe you go first, about how you've worked with other funders to support and strengthen democracy, or how you wish to, and maybe how you've also worked with policymakers or various governments or other sectors, the business sector or media, independent media, for instance, to kind of strengthen democratic rights and culture.
Well, I have two disclaimers. First, if you want me to talk about the past, I'll probably talk about the work with the Open Society Foundations, since we started just with the new foundation, Roma Foundation for Europe. And also being in a part of Open Society Foundations, you are blessed to have a single donor, Mr. Soros. You don't need necessarily to engage with other donors unless this is of strategic importance to leverage joint effort. And this is where we start. The work on the most oppressed and most disadvantaged gives you a certain perspective on the systemic issues that affect the whole society, because we feel the systemic problems and their underlying factors much earlier and deeper than anyone else. So that's why, as our work in Central Eastern Europe was grounded in the post-Berlin Wall, post-communist era, we could see already in 90s and early 2000 how democracy after the fall of Berlin Wall didn't deliver for us the same degree of freedom, the same degree of protection of rights, and the same degree of freedom of oppression like for other people. So we could see that, and this is what Mr. Soros saw as well. And in his own words, he said, the exclusion of Roma is unacceptable for an open society. This is why he decided to support the Roma for 4 decades almost, and so very generously. And this is where my work on building political organization and political power really matters, because we are building a political power of the least powerful or almost powerless. So doing that kind of work requires collective effort, at least within the community that we are trying to support. And this is where we started shifting our strategy in the last 10 years. This is maybe the first of the points about philanthropy and role of funders and how that role is changing. We tried in the last 10 years to move away from a usual approach of the funders, which is you support a single organization, looking at a single grant and looking at the success of that single organization and single grant. Even if you do it through a portfolio of grants, but contractually in terms of how you engage with people doing the work on the ground, you engage through a single channel. We saw that this has serious limitations, and we moved more into building ecosystems, bigger organizations and bigger systems that can scale up the collective effort, because at the end of the day, that really matters in democracy. So the first point I will bring to this organization is moving away from expecting that a single grant, a single organization will bring about change. Even it's not about coalition building, because coalitions are more about certain issue or area. Ecosystems that we are trying to build is also how different organizations reinforce their individual mandates, how they feed each other's impact rather than just looking at the joint impact. So this is where we moved in the last 10 years to build an ecosystem of Roma-led organizations that will fight for democracy as part of a greater collective.
Who, either Lisbeth or Lisa, would like to jump in on that? I appreciate the perspective of building ecosystems and not just coalitions. It does make me, I mean, both of you are in ecosystem building work. It does make me think a little bit about Lisbeth and this idea of funding ideas first. And I suppose both of you do, but at least Lisbeth, you mentioned it in your opening. And then also, Lisbeth, funding young people. And Željko, you mentioned about funding kind of the most vulnerable, the ones with the least power. And I wonder if that's resonant for you in the work of funding young people.
Maybe I should say a bit. I agree to what you said. I know we are trying to see if we could disagree to get some action going, but so far we are doing a bit poorly. Apologies for that. We'll try to improve our skills later on. Within the EED, we have a saying we fund the unfunded. And I think we will keep on doing that because there are many other great donors around that have different strategies and different avenues. But we still see that many of the smaller, unregistered, younger entities or individuals have difficulties in finding the resources they need to get going and get started. And in particular, in repressive regimes, it's even more difficult. And there is unfortunately a global trend that some of the larger donors are less risk-taking in some of the difficult countries or areas. So, you know, I will just invite for those who have flexibility in their funding to really reflect on what they could do in terms of keeping an open eye and a flexibility in their funds and not narrowing it down. What we see is that we meet people with great ideas, but who don't have big experience in doing fancy presentations or long proposals and all that. And that's fine with us because it's the idea we fall in love with. And then the coaching and the technicality and the support is the rest, which is another aspect of giving advice to other funders, is to invest in the people you're supporting, if possible. I think that has been a great success of our work. And then, of course, looking at the modalities in ED, we're able to give all kinds of funding, also co-funding, and I think that's essential as well. Many have this very focus on activities, and that does not really give sustainability for initiatives. It might be if it's a one-off. And when we talk about democracy, sometimes it's important to go in just before an elections to do a campaign or in other, one-off initiatives. And that's also okay. It's not everything that needs to grow and to become sustainable. It can be a one-off important idea that makes a change in that country. But keeping that flexibility has been essential to our work and something that I would advocate for other funders if it's possible for them.
Like me to jump in. Thanks for that, Lisbeth. I'm going to go back to go forward and first. Well, let me go back to go forward. There's this saying from a gentleman historian who had studied the downfall of civilizations. And it says, particularly civilizations that have some sort of freedom at the heart of what they do. And it starts off in bondage, and then people go from bondage to struggle, and then people go from struggle to freedom or liberation, then people go to liberation to abundance. Not everyone gets abundant, but to abundance, and then from abundance to apathy, and then from apathy back to bondage. And I think the fact that we are here talking, I'm seeing beginning really positive signals that donors, funders are beginning, not just OSF and Lisbeth, the work that you all have been doing, but new people are coming to the table nervous. Like the apathy piece has sort of hit us in the face and people are saying, okay, what do I do about this? Now, let me talk about some of the struggles that we have found and making this conversation beyond the usual suspects who quote unquote fund democracy, because we need much more than democracy funders to fund democracy. So what they'll say is traditionally, I think a lot of funders, even in the democracy space, have been funding defense and accountability and transparency to the bad actors. Now, that's good and fine. You need defense, but that has a supposition that all governments and all people and all politicians are part of the problem inside of it versus what is the offense? What do we want? And so we're in this moment of deep cynicism that change is even possible within our institutions or structures. So when I talk to democracy donors or donors in this space, and even the Democracy Fund itself had mapped a healthy democratic ecosystem. For example, they don't even have political leaders in that ecosystem, which if you think about it, many of our democracies have representative governments. Now, 51% of Europeans think politicians should be replaced by AI, even knowing the limitations of that. But we don't even have that in our perspective when we know oftentimes the downfall of our democracies are demagogue leaders. What I also hear from funders is we don't want to fund political leaders or political leadership or individuals because the system is broken, and they want to fund fixing the system. Well, how do you fund fixing the system unless you have the people to fix the system? So I'm beginning to see the logjam of thinking, of first order thinking and problem solving thinking opening up. And that is very exciting to me. And I want to give you a very specific example of a non-democracy funder seeing how this is important. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, for those of you who don't know, they're one of the larger foundations in the US and they fund health and well-being, has funded us to look at the first ever study of the mental well-being of politicians and how that impacts good people staying in the system to fix the system and be truly representative, and signaling that the job is an okay thing to do, right? It's very hard to be a politician. So how can we change the job itself so that people are going into politics, which we know we have a problem with that. I'm just using political leadership as a proxy. And then the last thing is how they can be effective solving really complex problems under threat. So here is a health and well-being funder funding their piece of contributing to democracy. And I think this is really important. We have to widen our aperture to think of democracy beyond just elections. And we need that too. But how, if you think of our societies as a house, and everyone has little important pieces of it, you know, plumbing and lights, you have to have good walls and a floor. And democracy, in my sense, and I agree with you, Željko, you can have philanthropy in a non-democratic space. I want to live in freedom. I think most of us do. So if everyone could contribute to their, if they're the bulb funder, then give a percentage of it to making sure that we have a floor and a ceiling around us so that that light can shine brightly. And I think that's the mentality we have to have. And we still can do this. We still can update our democracies for the 21st century, but it takes brave thinking, like we see healthcare funders or arts funders or climate funders thinking about the democratic role that they play. And I'm happy to see that they're waking up to that. I say that very respectfully.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to jump in and say, I remember we had a conversation, Josiane, about the different funders, and in my thinking, I mean, many are supporting a democratic development, even though they don't define themselves as a democratic funding institution. But I mean, funding education, funding well-being of children. I mean, most of the philanthropies that I know of in some way contribute to a more pluralistic democratic society. Perhaps it's not written into their policies, and maybe it's not a strategic terminology yet, but I think it's time for many of the funders maybe to reflect about it, that what they do is taking part in securing that we have more democratic and free societies. And maybe they need to be more vocal, as you say, Lisa. Maybe they need to go on the offensive a bit more to make it more clearly, and also to give the support and the self-confidence to those actors they are supporting, that they are part of building stronger democracies.
This is a great segue into the question around risk-taking. And you've kind of mentioned it anyway, when you talk about brave thinking and widening the aperture and going on the offensive. So maybe Lisbeth, you can actually continue, and Željko, I'll bring you in as well. But Lisbeth, the way that you talk about funding the unfunded and really, which for many funders is a massive risk, funding individuals, you know, funding young people when it comes to long-term impact, it's harder. So can you talk about how you've how you've approached risk-taking in the portfolio that you've been working with, and then also how you might encourage other funders and philanthropy to take more risks? What's their use case for it?
Sure. I think first I want to say that as I said, democracy entails many aspects, and I think many are taking part in it. And then the alternative, if you do not risk, if you don't take part, what is it that we are seeing? And we're seeing many negative developments and indicators on our democracy. So I think it's time to team up. And to say there are risks, yes, there might be, but if they don't fund, there are even larger risks. I mean, that's the short story. If you want to stay on the safe side, then we'll end on the wrong side, so to speak. And we've seen a trend in general about funding and even private public funding, that there are higher and higher requirements and accountability and so on. All good to be open and transparent about funding and so on. I don't think that you will find any of young people or democracy activists who do not want to go down that alley. So I don't think the risks are there. There might be risks of failure, okay, but that is needed to innovate and develop our societies. I don't think you will see, and we haven't seen in the European Endowment for Democracy very much misuse, or if any, because these are people and organizations burning to make a difference. So I think that fear for taking risks is perhaps needs to be changed into another narrative. Be part of the change, take part in the change, and be brave, because out of that bravery comes a lot of good. And we have in our relationships with all the partners we supported created a very strong relationship. As I mentioned, the coaching part is essential, because we're also talking about people with less experience in this kind of business, and that's fine. They still have their ideas, they're still experts on their context, they know what is needed locally to make a change in their country, and that's what matters. And then just a point on Lisa, I mean, we have also supported not directly political parties, because that's not part of our mandate, but we've supported civil society, strong leaders wanting to go into politics, wanting to create those ideas, seeing how society works. And one of them is now the president of a country in Moldova, funded by us, because she had the ideas. We didn't fund her party, but we funded the thoughts to think about how to develop and engage politically in society. So funding those transitions, moving from civil society into political leadership, is also really essential.
Mm-hmm. Željko, I'd love to bring you in on this, especially as you're developing the strategy for the Roma Foundation for Europe as well, and thinking about your portfolio and the work that you're doing. We've talked about this a little bit in advance, but to make the invisible visible. and to really put on the mainstream agenda an issue around the empowerment and involvement of Roma communities, proper funding and recognition of their contributions to different societies across Europe, right? So the question for you is slightly twofold. One is about your approach to taking risks and what you've heard so far and how you're reflecting on it. And then, Lisbeth, when you talk about funding transitions, this is also a future focused question. So maybe you can think about that and how you're thinking about building the future with the work that you're trying to do. And I feel like more than anything, the work you're trying to do is very future focused and very celebratory of a rich future and contribution from Roma.
Thank you, Josiah. So let me start then with the risk. I usually think along the lines of Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who speaks about skin in the game. So it is very, let's say, problematic if the funders and philanthropy continue expecting change on the ground from leaders to expose themselves to dangers of leading change and defending or promoting or advancing democracy, if the funders are not ready themselves to take share of the risk. So that skin in the game is, I think, essential for the topic of how funders engage in defending and promoting democracy. Now, again, whether we might disagree, as I will say a couple of controversial things. So first of all, I think I understand why Lisa says it is more than elections, but I would say elections are critical in this moment. Why? It is because those who threaten democracy use elections to undermine democracy, to demolish it and destroy it from inside. So I would say if there is a floodgate to be paid attention to, is the process of elections. And I'm not talking here only about elections day or immediately before elections when the campaign starts. Everything else happening around elections: electoral legislation, electoral practice, long-term observation, etc., etc. And this is where many of the funders get very uncomfortable for the various reasons. And some of them are legitimate. But I think elections are really critical as a pivotal point in which we see whether we have more or less of the threats for democracy. For me, it is a milestone. But everything that's happening, it's not only the moment of people casting the vote, but everything happening around that. Second, that in this context, the funders cannot remain only funders. What we are trying to do is to build a hybrid organization. We are not an NGO. We are not a political party. We are not an international organization. We are not a think tank. We are not an advocacy campaigner. But we want to build a hybrid, but taking different elements of all these forms and roles of organization. So that hybridity, I think, is the future for this work, because, classical way of having a strategy as a donor, eligibility criteria, and everyone coming to you as an ATM cash machine, putting the PIN code in terms of using the right words and ticking the boxes of eligibility criteria, is very dangerous for the times we live, because sitting back and approving grants is really not good enough. This is why often I heard from my colleagues in OSF, but also beyond, grantees are always right. It's a little bit like in business, that the clients are always right. I disagree with that, and I made this point so many times, because being a funder, supporting a field or ecosystem or number of grantees or an area gives you a kind of bird's eye perspective, gives you also an opinion, because I don't think that people working for philanthropic organizations are kind of value free. So I would rather seek the answer in particular context with grantees, rather than always saying grantees are always right and we only do what grantees believe it is right to do because they know the context. If we don't know the context, if we are not well informed about the world, then we better be informed and seek the answers with grantees. And this is where I think it is not good to be paternalistic, to say we know better than grantees, but also not being paternalistic in the way to say grantees always know better and we have no idea what to do. And this is because as human beings, we like comfort. And in organizations, we see, whether they are civil society or governments, we see routine, status quo, and bureaucratization that enables that comfort. The same is true for our grantees. And often we have to seed new ideas, seed new leadership, seed new organizations, seed new pathways. And that's, I think, also a much more risky and active role to take when you seed rather than sit back and support. So learning from these lessons, this is why we are building the Roma Foundation for Europe that is a hybrid, that is neither paternalistic to say we know better or grantees know better, but we are seeding new organizations and ideas as larger ecosystems through this hybrid role that we took, that we are not clearly a classical foundation. We are not a political party. We are not an NGO, etc., as I already explained, because this gives us more flexibility and more adaptability in the context in which we work.
Fantastic. That is, Lisa, I was going to bring you in, so I'm really glad you unmuted yourself. One of the questions we had from the chat, and thank you for sharing your questions in the chat. It's well received, and we'll discuss it now. But one of the first questions was around measuring impact, and how when you're thinking about flexibility and adaptability, you know, and taking risks and innovation, how do you help funders understand the impact of what you're doing on the ground?
Well, first, you're taking a risk by not acting on working on democracy. So we just have to quit the language that this is risky. It's risky by not doing it, and it's existential. It's existential risk. Number two, Željko, I completely agree. And I was going to sort of push us even harder that I am a little, I don't know what the word is, curious. It's probably the mature word. Frustrated is the immature word around all this discussion around democracy funding. Exactly to that point, we need political philanthropy. That is not partisan philanthropy, but to your point, the power in our democracies, often the switch between freedom and non-freedom, and minority rights protection, rule of law, comes in our systems the way they are now in political places. And we need to be investing in pipelines of pluralistic, quality political leaders that believe in a liberal democracy, whether they're from a little bit further left or a little bit further right or a little bit centrist, it doesn't matter. We need that. And that's exactly what we do. And I know, Lisbeth, this is what you were looking at, sort of talent this way. It's very interesting. The far right, who does not believe in liberal democracy, they invest in talent. And it tends to the center left invest in systems, right? So you can see this. We're playing this out right now. So what we've done, exactly what you're talking about, Željko, is we've built an ecosystem of what we call political leadership incubators, and we work with political leadership entrepreneurs around the world, from the Arctic to Congo to Portugal to Buenos Aires, to say, hey, look, we are civil society. We want to engage in politics. We don't know how to do that. How do we be transformative political leaders that actually deliver on democracy within that freedom piece? So this is way beyond elections. And there's absolutely ways to de-risk some of this for donors. I just want to answer this, and then I'll get to the measurement question, which I'm going to push back on a little bit as well. One of the things that we're looking at, it is risky not to move, and it's risky to move. I understand that. I have talked to some donors that they're afraid that if they get involved in political philanthropy, nonpartisan, non-electoral philanthropy, that they will be seen as manipulating their societies, right? And we've been looking at mechanisms around how do you pool funding so that there's safety in doing it, or how do you do philanthropy swaps? So we're looking at this very urgent time about how to do political philanthropy, which isn't existentially a threat to them, right? And the work that they do. So I think we can come together and be much more creative about how we bring more money into the system through high net worth individuals, I prefer crowdfunding as much as possible. I think democracy should be funded by and for the people. So what are the platforms that exist out there that we can do this? I'm very excited to say that Apolitical, from the very beginning, when we set up the company, which is a B Corporation, we gave stock to our foundation. So we hope to be a major political philanthropy when our company goes public or gets sold. So I think more entrepreneurs who are thinking about this political work needs to happen. On measurement, one of the things that I think that is a challenge with particularly new philanthropic money, but in general, is how do we measure impact? And we started off this conversation with looking at the art behind our walls. How do we measure the impact of the art behind you? We do not fund art because we can't measure it directly. So I get a little bit nervous in getting into this trap about how do you measure it. I can count people. I can count, this great story about Moldova, a new transformational person getting in. We can do the key performance indicators. We can have outcomes, but really we have to have people who aren't going to bean count our freedom. We need to have the ability to take the risk, to do things that I blame people who take philanthropic money who aren't agile and always learning and who aren't excellent. That you can push us, but do not bean count us into not doing anything because we can't prove it. Because changing the human condition and making people less cynical and having people feel engaged, measurable, of course, in some ways, but not perfect.
Okay. I've never heard impact measurement as bean counting before, but that's what it is. And I also love that you've brought the question of art and the intangibility of that as well. And the relationship between democracy, freedom we talked about, and the human condition as well. And this is where the question of the existent comes in. And I really appreciate that we're bringing that into this conversation. Another question we had was around the kind of organizational structures and capabilities that we need to invest in to be able to shift funding towards democracy-focused work. And so, how are you as funders or incubators of new political leaders and new ideas in this space, what kinds of new organizational capabilities are you spotting or are you investing in to grow? And the person who had submitted this question also said, keep in mind that many donors continue to be very demanding when it comes to what they define as accountability, and that keeps them tied to certain metrics and processes and practices. So let's talk about the organizations of the future that funders can be investing in, and maybe the funders themselves. Who wants to go first? I'll let you open. Lisbeth, I'm going to ask you.
Yeah, okay. There were many aspects and many questions there. First, let me just, Željko, on your thing about elections, that it's much more, and that the aspects. I just want to mention the latest report from the Witter Institute. It's an institute based out of Gothenburg in Sweden and one of the leading democracy measures institution. And their democracy report for 2024 is called Democracy Winning and Losing at the Ballot. So it's all about elections. And yes, as you said, Željko, autocrats have learned. They have their playbook and they're using elections as part of legitimizing their power. So it's really essential that we look at all the aspects of society and elections. And then I wanted to throw in some of the other challenging parts that Lisa also alluded to, that very far right political parties and entities in Europe. As far as we've seen, there is a consultancy company here in Denmark who've mapped the engagement of all political parties in Europe leading up to the EU elections at the European Parliament in June. And it seems very clear that the far right have invested much more money in using the social media and are doing it very, very well. So there is a way of getting out to people and getting out to those, back to the point of people that feel marginalized and not part of society. And apparently they are speaking to them. And again, it's not bipartisan, but that we have people on the far right and far left, whatever you want to call them, that are less democratic in their thinking, but having a lot of influence and power on social media, which is threatening our societies and democracies. On the funding issue of taking risks, I mean, and the demands, I alluded to it. Yes, demands are high in general. I think there needs to be a discussion among donors and funders of how to find a way of not drowning new organizations and people in requirements when they're actually out there and fighting for democracy. And that can be super challenging. I mean, we have people who are imprisoned, who have even been killed because of their conviction of fighting for democracy. So you really have to think about what demands you put on people if they're in that aspect of a very heavy regime. On the other hand, I mean, we do get funds from taxpayers, from member states in Europe. So the requirements back to governments funding the ED is there. And I know that the staff of the ED are working very, very hard on living up to all those requirements. We try to do it so that we can have less demands put towards those that are out there at the forefront fighting for democracy. But yes, it is a dilemma. But I'm sure that we've come to a peak now of administrative requirements, and I think we need to find a place where it balances off much better.
So if I was to just kind of bring that question back in and maybe make it a little bit more practical, because I know there are funders who will agree with you, but maybe don't quite know how to reduce the administrative demands because of the people they need to share the reports of the impact of the work that they're funding. What kind of new capabilities might organizations or grantees be demonstrating to make them more fundable? You know, what are you looking for these days? And maybe that's how we reframe the change in who we're funding is that they are, you mentioned having, strong ideas that then build ecosystems around them. And so what kind of new organizational capabilities and structures might be really appealing now when we think about kind of the new types of grantees that funders will be funding in this work?
I see your question, but maybe to say that again, it's not us to decide what is important. That comes from those that are at the forefront of a fight for democracy, and I think it comes very clearly from them. So I mean, at some point, Željko, your point of not always giving the customer the right, I would say here that we do listen to those that come to us, and they come to us. We're not out there pinpointing or so on. We are open. We don't have calls. We don't have thematic issues. It's the ideas that matter. So we, I think, are different from many other funders, and I would appeal to that to open up, not to put yourself into rigid boxes, because then you will have the professional applicants knowing exactly where to apply and so on. So you have to hear and listen and to see the good ideas, and then the rest is practicalities. Just, I mean, to make it very simple.
Could I build on that just quickly, Lisbeth? Because I agree that the ideas are really important. My experience in looking at we have a global launchpad for political leadership incubators. So we look at people who say, hey, I want to do this in my context. And what we really look for is people with operational excellence and ability to listen and correct themselves as they learn. And I say this because ideas obviously aren't enough. You have to be gritty. You have to sort of work hard. You have to go out and get other people on board of your ideas. You have to sell it. So it doesn't have to be entrepreneur language, but this ability to actually organize your way through a very hard thing. You have to love the hard thing. So we look a lot at mindset, skills. It's often, walking and chewing gum at the same time. Like, it's really complex bringing ideas to life. So it's the idea and that capability. And I'd say the thing that we find really, and oftentimes that's exhibited through they've done something like that before, but the problem is you always want to take a chance on the first time someone's done something right, because they could be the right people to do it. So we really look at, do they bring a team around them? What does that team look like? Do they have to be the star of that team? So we're seeing, particularly with young people coming, they're bringing diverse groups of people around them from the very beginning and sharing sort of the work. There's usually one person that's a bit of the leader in some sort of way, but they have a little flatter of an organization while someone still having responsibility. It's pretty obvious to say. I don't think we need that many new structures. I just think we need commitment to excellence, personally.
Okay. That brings us to our final question, actually, which is that if your work is successful, the work that you're all doing and investing in now, what will the world look like in the future? This commitment to excellence, I hear a lot from, and I hear some questions in the chat, and I'd like to bring those into this final reflection on what the world would look like in the future, right, if your work is successful. I hear for philanthropy to stay open and to be more involved in listening spaces. I hear reducing bureaucratic burdens. And for grantees, it's about the idea, and it's about the grit as well. So there's something about that we could bring in as well. So I'm going to go to you, Željko, for this question around what the future would look like if your work is successful. And we have a question from the chat about how to bring Roma into decision-making processes and how to invest in Roma youth as well. So maybe you can start answering that question.
Thank you, Lucian. I see that question comes actually from a good friend of mine, and I since we exchange quite regularly, I think this is more a question for Lisa and Lisbeth, as you know, he knows you are working together very closely. But I think your previous question about the organizations of the future and how the future would look like, you know, I'm really cautious about talking about future in terms of predictions or hopes, because you know, there are so many elements in the play. But I would say that we will certainly not solve all the problems in the future. But what I hope is to have different agency that we lack today, and that is necessary to uphold the commitment. Of course, our democracies are not perfect. There is a lot to be improved, but it is better than sliding into a dictatorship or autocracy. So at least defending what we have and then improving in parallel is something that lacks agency. Obviously, far right learned the game, especially after President Obama came into power and used technology. Far right learned all the techniques of marketing and how to use the technology and social media for it. And currently they are doing probably better, which is evident through the results they have, at least in Europe. So a couple of things. First of all, we will have agency and organizations that are built on collective capacity, not individual brilliance, because we've seen so many times brilliant individuals come fast, go fast, or come up and go down quite fast. So that growing of intellectual, collective, and leadership capacity is really critical. I hope to see more of that in the future, not only within the Roma leadership sphere, but more generally, and that Roma are part of a greater pro-democracy collective. Second, as I already mentioned, digital capabilities. This is not only about social media, but how the civil society not only protests against privacy and data in the digital sphere, and far right in the digital sphere, and racism in the digital sphere, but also uses technology itself to combat those vices. Then ability to scale faster than the competition, which means working with the people, with their constituency of the causes and political goals. We've seen that usually liberal, left, green parties and candidates, they avoid rural and poor and minorities. They, not always minorities, but rural and poor definitely. This is where we see the strength of the populists and the far right, because they go outside of the urban zones of our countries. When it comes to minorities, they do reach out to minorities, but more at the level of rhetoric, of identity politics, rather than actually engaging them in leadership of the parties and the positions of power. I also hope to see more of cross-sectoral collaboration. We usually think all the business is only about profit and all the civil society is only about moral high ground. I don't think this is true. I've seen so many times people in business, unfortunately, more committed to social good rather than those in civil society, who are trying to emulate the business and see fundraising as business. And finally, I wish to see more intelligence, not human intelligence, but a reliance on information and data, especially information and data about competitors and opponents in the democratic sphere and the sphere of protecting democracy. I've seen often both funders and civil society doing great analysis about ideas, systems, and policies, but too little about those engaged to abolish democracy. We are mostly led by ideals, but not serious intelligence about how we can weaken and overpower those trying to undermine and abolish democratic systems and democratic practice.
If this was a live room, that would get a round of applause, at least from me. Thank you, Željko. Lisbeth.
Yeah, I mean, you said we had to disagree, and that's becoming increasingly difficult. What I hope to see is building on young people's engagement in thematic issues. I mean, I see a lot of engagement there on climate, on other issues of inclusion, and so on, and that hopefully will inspire our formal structures to change. And then I see a lot of hope in what Lisa and her entities are doing, because that's what we need. We need to rebuild the trust in our systems. And we need to build trust in our politicians, and that's going to take some time and some efforts by all of us, and particularly we need to get those young people who are burning for one cause to understand that that's great, but that we need several causes to be met and to be fixed to both maintain and to improve and to strengthen our democratic societies.
Thank you, Lisbeth. Maybe if I can jump in off of that. And I really want to thank you from the very beginning of when we started scaling our work. You were there saying great idea and platforming us. And I'm just really grateful. And I hope we all can platform each other in however ways possible, because we need to do that. I am so excited about the wave of optimism against all odds that I see, particularly, but not only from young people and all the corners of the world. Speaking of this Roma question, there's a political leadership incubator started by these extraordinary folks from the private sector who came together to say we need to do something to strengthen democracy and put their own skin in the game and really are working on it. I see this time and time again. I see this from Daniel Sachs from the private sector, who's a supporter of many of ours. But in Portugal, the program is called Next Generation. And last time I was with the last cohort, there was a young Roma woman who was like wanting to run for office and not just represent her community, be a representative of everyone in the community, but a voice. And so I'm just full of hope. The biggest challenge I have, and I think the collective challenge we have, is one of this, and I'm nervous about the future, but sort of co-creating what we want that future to look like together. We need to make some major changes. We're pushing planetary boundaries. The billionaires are going to Mars, right? Like we have to some work to do. But I want to create space to thank people who do their best in the status quo so we can sort of let them go. My friend talks about hospicing the old ideas and giving them gratitude and thanks so that the new ideas and the new people can rise for that emerging future. And I think if one thing philanthropy could do would give exits to the old ideas, or perhaps the people who were there for a long time who did amazing work, but it's time that they moved on and gave space to other people. I've told my board that I'm here for 2 years and I want younger, different experienced people. So I think how we can get out of the way and move out of the way for other people is really, really important to do. We have a new person who just joined the team, Jordanian, Hussam. And he's been telling the barbershop and his parents and all these people, what are you doing? Trying to, rebuild trust in politicians in the 21st century. And they're like, why would you give your life to that? Like, they're all crooked. And what I think the provocation, not just to us as individuals, but to philanthropy and to everyone is, cynicism is the pill that evil wants you to swallow. It is definitely that. It's the belief that things are on track and you can do nothing about it. And my background is in brain and behavioral science. So I often go like, how can we address this cynicism? Because I'm a pathological optimist, because the opposite is really depressing. But in our brains, the 3 things that we can do to address this, one is be in community. And Željko, how you were talking about building ecosystems and working together, that is community, right? How we now are in community breaks cynicism. Being in gratitude for maybe thinking once a day, what has democracy done for me? Well, as a woman, I can walk down the street and the odds of me being catcalled or raped or murdered are much less than it used to be, right? So I'm not saying it's perfect for everyone, but I can think about my kids have access to free education. We have good healthcare. Like, it's not perfect, but just having a moment of gratitude in our lives for what our systems are doing before we talk about just what they're not doing. And then the last is like, this is really hard work, really hard work. We see people threatened, killed. I had a good friend murdered being a politician, a woman named Jo Cox. 1 out of every 6 women quit politics their first term because of the death threats. This is hard work. And I think along the way, we have to have joy. And that's what the science says, is that joy and pleasure with art in a very sort of inclusive way helps us break the cynicism. So we can't just be machines working on this. We have to be full humans breaking bread and dreaming inclusively together. So I hope everyone listening will take that back. Like, fight the cynicism. Don't fall for it's all done. We can do this.